Walk into the Cotton Club at 644 Lenox Avenue at 9:15 p.m. on March 7th, 1935, opening night after the club's relocation from its original downtown location, and you'll see something that's never happened before in the Cotton Club's history. A colored man in the audience, not performing, not serving drinks, not cleaning tables, sitting at a front row table, watching the show like he paid for admission, which he didn't because the Cotton Club doesn't sell tickets to colored people. That colored man is Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 29 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than the white patrons around him earn in 6 months. And sitting across from him, furious but trying to hide it, trying to smile for the other white customers, is Owney Madden, the white gangster who owns the Cotton Club and who just realized that Bumpy Johnson has decided to integrate his whites-only establishment, whether Madden likes it or not. The entire room has gone quiet. The band stopped playing mid-song. Duke Ellington, on stage, is staring. The white patrons are staring. The colored performers are staring. Because everybody understands what's happening. This isn't a colored man accidentally wandering into a white establishment. This is Bumpy Johnson deliberately, publicly, forcefully demonstrating that the racial rules white people created don't apply to him, that he goes where he wants, sits where he wants, does what he wants, and Owney Madden, despite being one of the most dangerous white mobsters in New York, can't do anything about it without starting a war he'll lose. This is the story of the night Bumpy Johnson integrated the Cotton Club by himself, armed with nothing but audacity and the reputation that made white gangsters afraid to challenge him. By sunrise Wednesday morning, all 6 were gone. No bodies, no witnesses, no arrests. Just 6 empty chairs at breakfast tables in the Bronx and Queens, 6 frantic wives making phone calls to police precincts that had no answers, and one very clear message delivered to Dutch Schultz and every other white mobster trying to muscle into Harlem: disrespect has consequences. This is the story of what happened on May 8, 1934. The story of the racial slur that triggered one of the bloodiest nights in Harlem's gang war. The story of how a single word, that word, the word no white man should ever say to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, set in motion a chain of events that left 6 men permanently erased from existence. The story of power and rage and violence and racial justice delivered not through courts or legislation, but through the brutal mathematics of street warfare. For the first time, people who were there that night, who saw what happened, who participated in what came after, have agreed to speak about May 8, 1934. Their testimonies reveal not just the mechanics of how 6 men disappeared, but why their disappearance was inevitable from the moment Arthur Delancey opened his mouth and said the one thing that could not be unsaid, could not be forgiven, could not go unpunished. Understanding what happened on May 8, 1934 requires understanding who Arthur Delancey was, where he came from, and how he came to be working as a numbers collector in Harlem for Dutch Schultz. Because Delancey wasn't just a random white thug, he was a product of a specific historical moment, a specific set of racial and economic circumstances that created thousands of men like him across New York in the 1930s. Men who grew up believing their whiteness entitled them to power over colored people. Men who joined criminal organizations because legitimate opportunities were scarce during the Depression. Men who died because they couldn't unlearn the racism that society had taught them from birth. Arthur Fingers Delancey was born on March 14, 1900 in the Bronx, the third of 5 children born to Patrick and Catherine Delancey, Irish Catholic immigrants who arrived in New York in 1894. The nickname Fingers came from his childhood reputation for picking pockets, a skill he developed at age 9 when his father abandoned the family and his mother needed him to contribute financially however he could. Delancey grew up poor, says Thomas Murphy, 88, a childhood friend of Arthur's who now lives in Queens, not starving poor like colored people in Harlem experienced, but working-class Irish poor. His mother cleaned houses, his older brothers worked in factories. Arthur started stealing because the family needed money, and stealing was easier than factory work that paid 50 cents a day for 12-hour shifts. But here's the thing people need to understand about Arthur and boys like him. They grew up believing that no matter how poor they were still better than colored people, that their whiteness counted for something, that being white meant they had rights and opportunities that colored people didn't have. Irish immigrants faced discrimination too. We were called dirty mix and treated poorly by established Americans. But we could still go places colored people couldn't go. We could still get jobs colored people couldn't get. We could still vote, could still sit anywhere on the train, could still use any water fountain or bathroom. Arthur understood from a young age that being white was valuable, that it gave him advantages. And as he got older, as he moved from petty theft into more organized crime, he learned that whiteness was currency in the criminal underworld too. White criminals could operate in any neighborhood. Colored criminals were restricted to colored neighborhoods. White criminals had connections with police and politicians that colored criminals couldn't access. White criminals ran the major criminal organizations, while colored criminals worked for them in subordinate positions. That's the world Arthur Delancey grew up in, a world where even white criminals had privileges that colored people didn't have. By 1932, when Arthur Delancey was 32 years old and the Great Depression had destroyed what little economic stability his family had achieved, he was working for Dutch Schultz's organization. Started as a collector for Schultz's beer operations during Prohibition, proved himself reliable, willing to use violence when necessary, loyal to Schultz. When Prohibition ended in 1933 and Schultz needed new revenue sources, when Schultz identified Harlem's numbers rackets as lucrative territory ripe for takeover, Delancey was one of the first enforcers Schultz sent into Harlem to assert control. Arthur told me in early 1934 that working Harlem was easy money, Murphy remembers. Said colored people were scared of white men, said they'd hand over their money without fight because they knew fighting back would bring more white men, more violence, more consequences. Said Schultz had police protection, so even if colored people complained, nothing would happen. Arthur thought it was the perfect setup. Easy work, good pay, no risk. He was wrong about the no risk part. Dead wrong. The other 5 men who disappeared with Delancey on May 8th were similarly products of Depression-era New York. Michael Corrigan, 29, from Hell's Kitchen, second-generation Irish, started in crime as a teenager running bootleg whiskey. James "Jimmy the Pipe" O'Malley, 35, also Irish, from the Bronx, known for carrying a lead pipe he used to beat people who didn't pay protection money. Robert Schulman, 28, German Jewish, from the Lower East Side, joined Schultz's organization after his father's grocery store failed in 1931. Vincent Tartaglia, 31, Italian from East Harlem, worked as muscle for Schultz's restaurant extortion rackets. Thomas "Red Tom" McCaffrey, 27, Irish from Brooklyn, Prohibition bootlegger who transitioned to numbers collecting when alcohol became legal. 6 white men from 6 different backgrounds, united by poverty, by the Depression, by the need for income, by criminal connections, and by one crucial factor, the belief that their whiteness protected them. The belief that they could come into a colored neighborhood, take money from colored people, treat colored people with contempt, and face no consequences because the entire structure of American society in 1934 protected white people and oppressed colored people. That belief, that assumption of white immunity, was about to be tested in the most final way possible. The afternoon started ordinarily enough for Arthur Delancey and his crew. They'd spent the day making their rounds through Harlem, collecting numbers bets from the runners who worked corners and storefronts between 110th Street and 145th Street, between 8th Avenue and the East River. The territory Stephanie St. Clair had built over 15 years, dollar by dollar, relationship by relationship, trust by trust. The territory Dutch Schultz decided he would take because he was white and powerful and believed Harlem belonged to whoever was strong enough to claim it. I was working a policy collection spot on 131st Street that day, remembers James Smokey Patterson, now 78, who was a 19-year-old numbers runner in 1934. These white boys came through around 6 o'clock, same as they did every Tuesday and Thursday. 6 of them, always the same 6. Delancey was the leader, the one who did the talking. The others just stood there trying to look tough, trying to intimidate us into believing they had the right to take Madam Queen's money just because Dutch Schultz said they did. To understand the rage that would fuel the events of that evening, you need to understand what the numbers racket meant to Harlem's economy and community in 1934. The numbers game, also called policy, was more than just illegal gambling. It was Harlem's informal banking system, its investment mechanism, its redistribution of wealth, its economic lifeline during the Depression. The numbers game was simple in concept but powerful in execution. Every day, runners like Patterson would collect bets, usually a penny, a nickel, a dime, from Harlem residents who'd pick 3 numbers. The winning numbers were determined by published data from racetracks, completely random and impossible to fix. If your numbers hit, you'd win at odds of 600 to 1. Bet a nickel, win $30. Bet a quarter, win $150. For poor people in Harlem earning maybe $10 or $15 a week, that kind of payout could change lives, could pay rent for 2 months, could buy clothes for children, could cover medical bills. But the numbers game meant more than just the possibility of winning, explains Dr. Vivian Chase, 71, a historian who's written extensively about Harlem's informal economy in the 1930s. It meant jobs, hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs. Numbers runners earned a percentage of what they collected. Collection spots provided employment. Bankers, the people who actually ran the operations and paid out winners, made good livings. The entire structure employed more Harlem residents than any legitimate business in the neighborhood. And crucially, the money stayed in Harlem. The bankers reinvested in the community. They loaned money to black entrepreneurs who couldn't get bank loans. They funded churches and community organizations. They helped families in crisis. Casper Holstein, one of the early numbers kings, sent dozens of Harlem kids to college with scholarships funded by his numbers profits. Stephanie St. Clair was known for being generous with community members who needed help. The numbers racket was Black Harlem's way of building wealth in a system that denied black people access to conventional wealth-building mechanisms. Banks wouldn't lend to colored people. Legitimate businesses wouldn't hire colored people for professional positions. The numbers racket was how working-class black people invested their pennies and how successful black criminals became philanthropists and community leaders. When Dutch Schultz moved into Harlem in early 1934, he wasn't just stealing money. He was destroying an entire economic ecosystem. He was extracting wealth from the black community and transferring it to white mobsters. He was eliminating jobs. He was breaking the cycle of community reinvestment that made the numbers racket valuable beyond just its gambling function. We handed over the collection bags like we'd been doing for 3 months, Patterson continues. Ever since Schultz started muscling into Harlem in February, we had to give up 60% of everything we collected. 60% to white mobsters who'd never set foot in Harlem until they decided our money was theirs for the taking. 60% that used to pay runners' salaries, that used to fund community projects, that used to stay in Harlem and help Harlem people. Now it was going to the Bronx, going to white criminals who had no connection to Harlem except exploitation. It made us sick, but what could we do? Schultz had police protection. He had political connections. He had hundreds of enforcers. Madame Queen told us to cooperate, to stay alive, to wait because she was planning something. She had Bumpy Johnson working on something. Stephanie Queenie St. Clair was unlike any other crime boss in New York's history. Born in Martinique in 1886 or 1887, records conflict, she'd arrived in Harlem in 1912 as a teenage immigrant with no money, no connections, and no formal education. But she had intelligence, ambition, fearlessness, and a talent for understanding systems and exploiting their weaknesses. By 1922, Madam Queen had saved $10,000, a fortune for a colored woman in that era, and invested it all in starting her own numbers bank. Within 3 years, she controlled a substantial portion of Harlem's numbers racket. By 1930, she was one of the wealthiest black women in America, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per year from gambling operations. But Madame Queen wasn't just a criminal, explains Shirley Clark, 79, whose mother worked as one of St. Clair's runners in the 1920s. She was a community leader. She was political. She spoke out against police corruption, against politicians who ignored Harlem's needs, against the racism that kept colored people subordinated. She took out full-page advertisements in the Amsterdam News denouncing corrupt cops and crooked judges. She testified before government commissions about police payoffs. My mother used to say that Madame Queen was proof that colored women could be just as powerful as white men if society would let them. She ran a multi-million-dollar operation. She employed hundreds of people. She made white politicians nervous because she couldn't be controlled or intimidated. She was brilliant and sophisticated and absolutely fearless. When Dutch Schultz decided to take over Harlem's numbers rackets in early 1934, he was picking a fight with someone who wouldn't back down, who couldn't back down because backing down meant losing everything she'd built, meant surrendering not just money but dignity, independence, proof that colored people could succeed despite white supremacy trying to keep them subordinated. Schultz came at her systematically. He used violence against runners who wouldn't cooperate, had them beaten, had collection spots firebombed, had competing bankers kidnapped. Casper Holstein was snatched off the street in 1928, held for ransom, returned broken and terrified. Schultz used political connections to have Madame Queen harassed by police, arrested on flimsy charges, tied up in legal proceedings. He corrupted some of her employees, convinced them to switch sides, to work for white mobsters who paid better because they didn't have to worry about reinvesting in the community. By spring 1934, Schultz controlled perhaps 40% of Harlem's numbers racket. He was winning, and he was emboldened by his success to become more aggressive, more disrespectful, more openly contemptuous of the colored people whose businesses he was stealing. But that Tuesday, something was different. Delancey was drunk or high or just feeling particularly bold because he started talking more than usual, started making jokes about colored people, about how we were too stupid to run our own businesses, about how Schultz was doing us a favor by taking over. And one of the young runners, kid named Marcus, who couldn't have been more than 17, he made a comment. Nothing disrespectful, just said something like, "We were doing fine before you came." The temperature in the room changed instantly, Patterson continues. Delancey's whole face twisted up. He walked over to Marcus and got right in his face. And then he looked at me and the other 4 runners in that room, and he said, ours better remember who owns Harlem now? Ours work for Mr. Schultz? Ours do what you're told and keep our mouths shut." He used that word. Used it 4 times in 3 sentences. Used it like it was casual, like it was nothing, like calling us that was just part of business, and we just stood there because what could we do? If we fought back, Schultz would have us killed. If we reported it to police, they'd laugh because half of them were on Schultz's payroll. We were powerless, and Delancey knew it. That's why he said it, because he could. What Arthur Delancey didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was walking past that collection spot at the exact moment those words left his mouth. That Bumpy, who'd been checking on Madame Queen's operations across Harlem that afternoon, who happened to be passing by on his way to meet with his crew, heard every word through the open window, heard a white man call colored people ours 4 times, heard the casual contempt, the assumption of white supremacy, the belief that Delancey's whiteness gave him the right to dehumanize black people without consequence. To understand Bumpy Johnson's reaction to that racial slur, you have to understand what that word meant to him personally, have to understand his history with racism and violence and powerlessness and the rage that had been building inside him since childhood in South Carolina. Bumpy Johnson was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson on October 31, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, into poverty so extreme it shaped every aspect of who he would become. His family was desperately poor. His father earned 60 cents a day as a dock worker when he could get work. His mother worked as a domestic servant for white families, earning $2.50 per week for 72 hours of labor. When Bumpy was 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Accused, not proven. The accusation alone was enough to bring lynch mobs to their door. Bumpy's parents mortgaged everything they owned, their tiny shack of a house, their few possessions, to send Willie north to relatives in Harlem because staying in South Carolina meant certain death. A colored boy accused of killing a white man wouldn't get a trial, wouldn't get due process, would get a rope and a tree and a mob. Bumpy witnessed all of that, witnessed the terror in his parents' eyes, witnessed his brother fleeing in the night, witnessed his family destroyed financially to save one son's life, and Bumpy learned a fundamental lesson about America in 1915. Colored lives didn't matter. Colored people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Colored people could be killed with impunity, and the killers would face no consequences. When Bumpy arrived in Harlem in 1919, he was 14 years old and burning with rage at the injustices he'd experienced, explains Theodore Lawrence, 73, a historian who studied Bumpy's early life extensively. He'd watched his parents humiliated daily by white employers who treated them as less than human. He'd watched his brother nearly lynched. He'd experienced hunger because his parents' labor was compensated at rates that made feeding a family impossible. He'd been called that word, N-R, more times than he could count by white people who used it casually, confidently, as though colored people weren't even human enough to deserve respectful language. All of that trauma, all of that rage, all of that powerlessness, Bumpy carried it with him to Harlem, and instead of breaking him, it fueled him. It motivated him to never be powerless again, to accumulate enough power that no white person could degrade him without facing consequences. When Bumpy started working for Stephanie St. Clair in the early 1930s, he wasn't just an employee, he was her most trusted lieutenant, her enforcer, her strategic mind. St. Clair recognized that Bumpy had something most street criminals lacked: intelligence combined with absolute ruthlessness, the ability to plan carefully and execute violently, the discipline to wait for the right moment instead of acting impulsively. Bumpy was different from other gangsters I'd met, St. Clair told an interviewer in 1965, 3 years before Bumpy's death. Most criminals were reactive. They'd respond to problems with immediate violence. Bumpy was strategic. He'd study situations. He'd plan. He'd wait for exactly the right moment to act so that his violence would have maximum impact. And he had this rage in him, this controlled, focused rage at white supremacy, at racism, at the entire system that treated colored people as inferior. Most people who experience that kind of rage either explode destructively or get crushed by it. Bumpy channeled it, used it as fuel. Every time a white person disrespected him or disrespected colored people generally, he'd file it away, remember it. And when the opportunity came, he'd deliver consequences. I saw Bumpy stop on the sidewalk, says Fast Willie Rollins, 76, who was Bumpy's driver and bodyguard in 1934, saw his whole body go rigid, saw his jaw clench, saw his hands curl into fists. I'd seen Bumpy angry before. He'd been angry most of his life about the injustices colored people faced, but this was different. This was cold rage, controlled rage. The kind of rage that doesn't explode immediately, but burns slow and plans carefully and executes perfectly. We'd been walking together, me and Bumpy, checking on collection spots across Harlem. It was part of our routine. Bumpy would visit different locations, make sure the runners were safe, make sure Schultz's men weren't causing more trouble than they already were, make sure Madame Queen's remaining operations were functioning properly despite the pressure from the white mob. When we passed that collection spot on 131st, the window was open because it was warm that day, maybe 75 degrees. beautiful spring afternoon, and Delancey's voice carried through that open window clear as a bell. You ours better remember who owns Harlem now. You ours work for Mr. Schultz. You ours do what you're told and keep your our mouths shut. I saw Bumpy's entire demeanor change, Rollins continues. It was like watching a machine switch on. He didn't yell, didn't charge into that collection spot, didn't do anything that would alert Delancey and his crew that they'd been overheard. He just stood there for maybe 10 seconds, listening, and I could see him thinking, could see him planning, could see him making calculations about what had to happen next. Then he turned to me and said, and I'll never forget these exact words. He said, "Those white boys just bought themselves tickets to hell. Follow them when they leave. Don't let them see you, but find out where they're going. I'll be at the warehouse on 142nd. Come tell me their location. We got work to do tonight." The calmness in his voice was terrifying, because I knew what work meant. I knew that Delancey and his crew had hours left to live, maybe less, and Bumpy had already decided exactly how it would happen. The thing about that particular racial slur, that word, is it represented everything Bumpy Johnson had dedicated his adult life to fighting against, Lawrence explains. It wasn't just an insult, it was a dehumanization, a declaration that colored people weren't fully human, that they existed in a subordinate category, that they could be owned, controlled, disrespected without consequence. For Bumpy, who'd spent 15 years building power specifically to protect colored people from that kind of degradation, hearing Delancey use that word wasn't just personally offensive. It was a challenge to everything Bumpy represented. It was a white mobster coming into a black neighborhood and declaring that despite Bumpy's power, despite the community's resistance, white supremacy still ruled, that colored people were still ours who had to do what white men told them. Bumpy couldn't let that stand, couldn't let Delancey walk away from using that word without consequences, because if Delancey could use that word and survive, if other white enforcers heard that Delancey had called colored people ours to their faces and faced no punishment, then Bumpy's power meant nothing. Then Harlem's resistance meant nothing. Then colored people were still powerless despite everything Bumpy and Madam Queen had built. So Delancey had to die, had to disappear, had to serve as an example so extreme that every other white mobster in New York would understand, you don't use that word in Harlem, you don't disrespect colored people in Bumpy Johnson's territory, you don't assume your whiteness will protect you, because it won't. Bumpy didn't go into that collection spot, didn't confront Delancey right then. He just stood on that sidewalk for maybe 10 seconds listening. Then he turned to me and said, "Follow those white boys when they leave. Don't let them see you, but find out where they're going. I'll be at the warehouse on 142nd. Come tell me their location." Then Bumpy walked away, calm as could be, but I knew. Everybody who knew Bumpy knew. Those white boys were dead men. They just didn't know it yet. The decision to make Arthur Delancey and his crew disappear wasn't impulsive, wasn't heat-of-the-moment violence, wasn't even primarily about that specific racial slur, though that was the trigger. The decision was strategic, calculated, part of a larger plan Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair had been developing for weeks. A plan to demonstrate that white mobsters weren't invincible in Harlem, that colored people could fight back. That disrespect would be met with consequences so severe they'd make every other white enforcer think twice before setting foot in Harlem again. The warehouse on 142nd Street where Bumpy assembled his crew was owned through a shell company by Stephanie St. Clair. It was 3 stories, brick construction, with loading docks in the back that opened onto an alley providing discreet access. The ground floor was nominally a legitimate storage facility for furniture. The second floor contained offices that Madam Queen used for managing her numbers operations. The third floor was where Bumpy conducted business that required privacy. That's where Bumpy and I went after following Delancey's crew to the saloon on 138th, Rollins remembers. By the time we got there, Bumpy had already made phone calls, already assembled his core team, already started planning the specifics of what would happen that night. Madame Queen and Bumpy had been planning a response to Schultz's takeover since March, explains Robert Bobby Light Henderson, 79, who was part of Bumpy's crew in the 1930s. We couldn't take on Schultz directly. He had too many men, too much money, too much police protection. But we could pick off his enforcers, make them scared to come to Harlem, make it cost more to hold Harlem than it was worth to Schultz. Guerrilla warfare, we called it. Hit and run, strike when they're vulnerable, disappear before they can retaliate, make them paranoid, make them scared. But we were waiting for the right moment, the right justification, something that would make the whole community understand why we had to do what we were about to do. Something that would make it clear this wasn't just criminals fighting criminals, but colored people defending themselves against white supremacy. Delancey gave us that justification. When Bumpy told us what Delancey said, when he repeated those exact words, "You ours better remember who owns Harlem now," everybody in that room understood. This wasn't just business anymore. This wasn't just about numbers, rackets, and money. This was about dignity, about refusing to let white men come into our community and dehumanize us without consequence. This was about drawing a line and saying no further. This was about proving that colored people in Harlem in 1934 would not tolerate being called NRs by white mobsters who thought their whiteness made them untouchable. The 9 men Bumpy assembled that night were carefully chosen. These weren't random street criminals looking for quick money. These were Bumpy's most trusted soldiers, men who'd proven themselves loyal, men who understood operational security, men who could execute complex plans under pressure, men who'd kill when necessary and keep silent forever about what they'd done. There was Robert Bobby Light Henderson, 29 in 1934, who got his nickname because he was so pale-skinned he could sometimes pass for white when useful. There was Willie, Fast Willie Rollins, Bumpy's driver and closest friend since childhood in Charleston. There was Patterson James, the oldest at 37, who'd worked as a butcher before turning to crime and knew exactly how to efficiently dispose of bodies. There was Marcus, quiet Marcus Williams, who never spoke unless necessary, but could kill silently with his hands. There was Samuel, Sam the Barber Richardson, who ran a legitimate barbershop on Lenox Avenue as cover for his real work as one of Bumpy's enforcers. There was Jerome, Little J. Washington, the youngest at 23, small in stature but vicious in temperament. There was David Two-Gun Hamilton, named for his preference for carrying matched pistols. There was Raymond the Scholar Thompson, who'd attended 2 years of college before the Depression forced him into crime and who served as Bumpy's strategic planner. And there was the 9th member, whose name has been lost to history because he died in 1937 during a separate gang conflict and whose identity the surviving members refused to reveal out of respect for his family. Every one of those men had personal reasons to hate Dutch Schultz and what he represented, Henderson explains. Bobby Light's sister had been assaulted by one of Schultz's enforcers. Fast Willie's cousin had been beaten nearly to death for refusing to cooperate with the mob takeover. Patterson James had watched his father's small grocery store driven into bankruptcy by Schultz's protection racket. Quiet Marcus's mother had been humiliated by white police officers working for Schultz. Sam the Barber had been forced to pay tribute to white mobsters to keep his legitimate business operating. We weren't just criminals. We were colored men living in a system designed to oppress us. And Schultz represented everything we hated about that system. He was white. He was powerful. He was protected by corrupt police and politicians. He thought he could come into our neighborhood and take what he wanted because society had taught him that white men always won and colored people always lost. We were about to teach him different. At 7:15 p.m., approximately 28 minutes after Arthur Delancey called Marcus a N.R., Bumpy Johnson assembled 9 men in a warehouse on 142nd Street. These weren't random street criminals. These were Bumpy's most trusted soldiers, men who'd proven themselves loyal, men who understood what was about to happen and why it had to happen, and who were willing to risk their lives to make it happen. Fast Willie had tracked Delancey's crew to a saloon on 138th Street where they'd stopped for drinks before heading back to the Bronx. 6 white men in a Harlem saloon at sunset, celebrating another day of taking money from colored people, completely unaware that their survival was now measured in minutes, not hours. The saloon itself was one of the few establishments in Harlem that still served white customers without question. Most Harlem speakeasies and restaurants had become increasingly unwelcoming to white faces as racial tensions escalated through the early 1930s. But this particular saloon, owned by a colored man named Jacob Waters, who'd served in World War I alongside white soldiers and maintained complicated feelings about race relations, still operated as neutral territory where anyone's money was good. Waters is dead now, died in 1952, but his son, Jacob Waters Jr., 69, remembers his father's account of that evening. "My father said those 6 white men came in around 7 o'clock, ordered whiskey, sat at a back table talking loud and laughing, said they were celebrating something, making jokes. Said one of them, my father later learned it was Delancey, kept using that word, the N-word, saying it casual, like it was nothing, like the colored staff serving them weren't even human enough to be offended. My father was conflicted because on one hand, money was money and he needed the business. Depression was hard on everybody and those white boys were spending freely. But on the other hand, they were disrespecting his staff, disrespecting his customers, disrespecting colored people generally, and my father knew Bumpy Johnson, knew that if Bumpy heard about white men coming into a Harlem saloon and openly using racial slurs, there'd be consequences. My father almost asked them to leave, almost told them their money wasn't worth the trouble they'd bring, but before he could make that decision, they'd finished their drinks and left. Walked out into the spring evening, still laughing, still celebrating, completely unaware they had maybe 20 minutes left to live. Bumpy laid out the plan with the precision of a military operation, Henderson remembers. He'd spent hours thinking about this, about how to make people disappear without leaving evidence, without creating bodies that could be traced back to us. He'd studied how it worked, how to do it cleanly, how to do it permanently. The room on the 3rd floor of the warehouse had a large table in the center. Bumpy stood at the head of that table with a map of Harlem spread out in front of him. He'd marked the saloon where Delancey's crew was drinking, marked the route they'd most likely take back to their cars, marked 3 different locations where we could intercept them, marked secondary locations where we could take them to finish what needed finishing, marked disposal sites outside Harlem where the bodies would never be found. He'd thought of everything, every detail, every contingency, every possible complication. We'd split into 3 teams of 3, Bumpy explained. First team, me, Fast Willie, and Patterson James, would take Delancey and Corrigan when they left the saloon. Second team, Quiet Marcus, Sam the Barber, and Little J, would get O'Malley and Schulman. Third team, Henderson, Two Gun, and the Scholar, would handle Tartaglia and McCaffrey. 3 teams. 3 different interception points along the route from the saloon to where their cars were parked. 3 different locations for finishing the work. 6 men disappeared using 6 different alleys, 6 different secondary locations, making it look like 6 unrelated incidents if anybody ever connected the dots, which Bumpy was confident they wouldn't. The weapons were simple. No guns, because guns are loud and leave bullets that can be traced. Knives and hands and rope. Ice picks for quick, quiet killing. Garrots made from piano wire. Tools that left minimal blood, that could kill silently, that could be disposed of easily. The first rule Bumpy emphasized was no witnesses. We'd move fast. We'd strike in dark locations. We'd control the scene completely before taking action. No innocent bystanders could see what was happening. No complications, no collateral damage. The second rule was no bodies in Harlem. We'd take them somewhere else. Dispose of them somewhere else. Make it look like they'd vanished on their way home. Let Schultz and the police wonder. Let them search. Let them never find anything. The third rule was timing. We had to move simultaneously or near simultaneously. If one team struck and the others didn't, the surviving targets would be alerted. They'd run. They'd call for backup. The whole operation would fall apart. So we'd position ourselves at 3 different interception points. We'd wait, and when Delancey's crew split up, Bumpy was confident they would split up because they always split up, traveling in pairs rather than all six together. We'd strike within minutes of each other. Bumpy was very specific about one thing, Henderson continues. He said, "Before you finish this, each of those men needs to know why this is happening. They need to know it's because of what Delancey said. They need to know that calling us NRs has consequences. Make sure they understand. Make sure they know that Bumpy Johnson heard what Delancey said. Make sure they know this is justice for disrespecting colored people. Then make sure they disappear." That last instruction was important. It wasn't enough for these men to die. They had to die knowing why. They had to die understanding that their racism, their casual contempt for colored people, their assumption of white supremacy, that those things had cost them their lives. They had to die with the knowledge that they'd been wrong about colored people being powerless, that they'd misjudged Harlem, that they'd made a fatal mistake in believing their whiteness would protect them. Bumpy wanted them to carry that knowledge into death, wanted their last moments to be filled with the understanding that the racial hierarchy they'd relied on their whole lives, white on top, colored on bottom, didn't apply in Harlem on this night. That power had shifted. That justice was being delivered by the very people they'd thought were powerless. The psychological aspect was crucial, explains Dr. Lawrence. Bumpy wasn't just eliminating threats, he was sending a message. And part of that message required the victims themselves to understand why they were dying, required them to acknowledge, even if only in those final moments, that colored people weren't inferior, weren't powerless, weren't passive victims who would accept degradation without response. It was brutal, but it was also a form of education. These white men had lived their entire lives believing one version of reality, the version where white supremacy was natural and permanent and unassailable. Bumpy gave them a different reality in their final moments, the reality where racism has consequences, where disrespect carries costs, where white skin doesn't guarantee immunity from justice. That was the plan. That was what Bumpy laid out to those 9 men in the warehouse on 142nd Street. And every man in that room understood the stakes, understood the risks, understood what success would mean for Harlem and what failure would mean for them personally. And every man in that room committed, agreed to do what needed doing, agreed to carry that secret for the rest of their lives. Because this wasn't murder for profit. This wasn't gang warfare over territory. This was resistance. This was colored people saying we've had enough. This was justice delivered outside the legal system because the legal system existed to protect white supremacy, not to protect colored people from white supremacy's violence. At 8:47 p.m., as dusk settled over Harlem and the May evening turned from warm to cool, Arthur Delancey and Michael Corrigan left the saloon and started walking toward Lenox Avenue where they'd parked their car. They were laughing. Delancey was still making jokes about colored people, about how easy it was to intimidate them, about how much money Schultz was making off Harlem's numbers rackets. They made it approximately 2.5 blocks before they encountered Bumpy Johnson's Justice. They never made it to their car. 3 men materialized out of the gathering darkness, appeared so suddenly that Delancey and Corrigan didn't have time to react, didn't have time to reach for the weapons they carried, didn't have time to scream. One moment they were walking alone on an empty stretch of sidewalk between streetlights. The next moment they were surrounded, a knife at each throat, hands on their arms preventing movement, voices saying, "Don't scream, don't fight, just walk," saying, "We'll kill you right here if you make a sound," saying your only chance to survive the next 5 minutes is to do exactly what we tell you. Delancey and Corrigan did what people do when confronted with immediate mortal threat. They complied. They walked where they were told to walk. They stayed silent when ordered to stay silent. They held on to the desperate hope that cooperation might mean survival, not understanding that survival had never been an option from the moment Delancey called Marcus a N.R. They were herded into an alley between 138th and 139th Street, an alley with no light, no witnesses, no escape, an alley where they stopped being white men with power and became just two men who'd made a fatal mistake. I was one of the three who took Delancey, says Patterson James, 81, who's never before publicly discussed his role in the events of May 8th. He's agreed to speak now because, as he says, I'm old, I'll be dead soon anyway, and people should know what happened. People should understand why it happened. When we got them in that alley, when we had them secured, hands bound behind their backs with rope, backs against the brick wall, knives still at their throats, I looked at Delancey and I said, "You remember what you said this afternoon about ours? You remember calling us that? Calling colored people that like it was nothing? Like we were less than human?" And his face went white, whiter than it already was. His whole body started trembling, because he understood. In that moment, standing in a dark alley in Harlem with three colored men who clearly intended to kill him, Arthur Delancey understood exactly why this was happening. Understood that his casual racism, his comfortable contempt, his assumption of white immunity, all of that had led him to this moment. He tried to talk, tried to say it was just words, tried to say he didn't mean anything by it, tried to apologize. His voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand him. He said he was sorry, said he wouldn't do it again, said, "Please, please don't kill me. I got a wife. I got kids. Please." I asked him if he knew who sent us. He shook his head, tears running down his face now. I said, "Bumpy Johnson heard what you said. Bumpy Johnson don't forget. Bumpy Johnson don't forgive. And Bumpy Johnson wants you to know that disrespecting colored people in Harlem has consequences. You called us nen-ers. You treated us like we were nothing, like we had no power, like we couldn't fight back. You were wrong." Corrigan started begging, too. Started saying it was Delancey who said it, not him. Started trying to distance himself. But we knew Corrigan had been there, had been part of it, had laughed when Delancey used that word, had participated in the degradation even if he hadn't spoken the words himself. Complicity is guilt. Silence in the face of racism is participation in racism. Corrigan was just as guilty as Delancey. Delancey tried one more time, tried to offer money, said he had $300 in his pocket, we could have it all, just let him go. Said Schultz would pay ransom, would pay whatever we wanted, said we could name our price, but there was no price, no amount of money that would undo what he'd said, no amount of money that would restore the dignity he'd tried to steal from colored people by calling them NRs. This wasn't about money. This was about justice. This was about consequences. This was about making it clear that white supremacy had limits in Harlem, that colored people would defend their dignity with the same violence that white people had used for centuries to enforce racial hierarchy. I told Delancey there was no price, told him the debt he owed couldn't be paid in money, told him that colored people in Harlem were taking back their power, that white mobsters were no longer invincible, that racism would no longer go unpunished. Then we killed them. What happened in that alley happened quick, Patterson says quietly. I won't give all the details. I won't describe every moment of it, but I'll say this. It was efficient. It was final, and it was done in a way that left no evidence. We'd learned from Bumpy, learned that violence has to be controlled, has to be purposeful, has to accomplish specific goals. Delancey and Corrigan died within seconds of each other. Quick cuts to major arteries. They bled out fast, didn't suffer long. We weren't sadists. We weren't trying to torture them. We were just trying to make them disappear, to send a message, to deliver consequences. The mechanics of disposing of bodies. This is the part that required the most planning, the most precision. We had canvas tarps ready, heavy-duty, waterproof. We wrapped the bodies tight, securing them with rope so nothing leaked. We had a truck waiting 2 blocks away, driven by a man whose name I still won't reveal even now, 70 years later. That driver wasn't part of the crew, was just doing a job, didn't ask questions, got paid well to keep his mouth shut. We loaded Delancey and Corrigan into that truck, covered them with furniture and boxes to look like a normal delivery vehicle if anyone saw us, drove them out to New Jersey, a location we'd scouted days earlier, an abandoned industrial site near the meadowlands that wouldn't be developed for another 20 years. We dug a hole 10 feet deep, put the bodies in, covered them with lime to speed decomposition and control odor, filled the hole back in, covered it with rubble and trash to make it look like just another dumping site in an industrial wasteland. By 10:30 p.m., Delancey and Corrigan had ceased to exist. Two white men who woke up that morning thinking they'd live forever had become nothing but buried meat in New Jersey dirt. Their wives would never know what happened to them. Their children would grow up without fathers. Their families would mourn absence without closure, but Harlem would know. The colored community would understand. White mobster called colored people Nepentars. White mobster disappeared. Cause and effect, action and consequence. While Delancey and Corrigan were being erased from existence in that alley, the other two teams were executing their parts of the plan with equal precision 3 blocks away in different locations. The coordination was near perfect. All three teams struck within a 15-minute window between 8:45 and 9 p.m., giving the victims no opportunity to warn each other, no chance to escape. James O'Malley and Robert Schulman had left the saloon around the same time as Delancey and Corrigan, but they'd gone in a different direction, north toward 140th Street, where they'd parked their car. They were intercepted by Quiet Marcus, Sam the barber, and Little Jay in an alley behind a warehouse that processed poultry. The smell of chicken blood and feathers masked any evidence that might have been left behind. Marcus never talked much about what happened that night, says his daughter, Geneva Williams, 68. But he told me once, years later when he was dying and wanted to clear his conscience, that those white men begged for their lives, that they cried, that they offered money, offered information about Schultz's operations, offered anything they thought might save them. But there was nothing they could offer that mattered. They'd been sentenced to death the moment Delancey opened his mouth. Their execution was just the delivery of that sentence. My father said he made sure O'Malley and Schulman knew why they were dying, made sure they understood this was about Delancey's racism, made sure they understood that even though they hadn't personally used that word, they'd been there. They'd allowed it. They'd laughed. They'd participated in the degradation of colored people, and participation carried the same penalty as direct action. Vincent Tartaglia and Thomas McCaffrey were the last to be taken. They'd stayed at the saloon longer than the others, finishing another round of drinks, and they left around 9 p.m. They were intercepted by Bobby Light, Two Gun Hamilton, and the Scholar on 137th Street, in what used to be a stable before automobiles made horses obsolete in the city. The building was scheduled for demolition, making it perfect for what Henderson's team needed to do. Henderson has been more willing than the others to discuss details, perhaps because he's always been the most philosophical about what happened that night. Tartaglia was maybe the worst of the six, Henderson says. He was mean, enjoyed hurting people. We'd heard stories about him beating numbers runners half to death for sport, not even because they'd done anything wrong, just because he liked inflicting pain on colored people. And McCaffrey wasn't much better. He was one of those quiet types who didn't talk much but watched everything, and you could see the contempt in his eyes when he looked at colored people. When we got them in that stable, when we told them why this was happening, Tartaglia tried to fight, actually thought he could fight his way out, even though he was outnumbered 3-1 and we were all armed. Two Gun had to pistol whip him to get him under control, and even then, even with a broken nose and blood running down his face, Tartaglia was cursing us, calling us that word, the same word that had gotten him into this situation, like he couldn't understand that his racism was what was killing him. Like he thought being white entitled him to disrespect colored people, even while those colored people were literally executing him for that disrespect. McCaffrey was different. He understood immediately that he was going to die, got very quiet, very calm, asked if he could pray. We let him. Didn't seem right to deny a man his last words with God, even if that man had spent his life disrespecting God's colored children. He knelt there in that abandoned stable and prayed for maybe 2 minutes. Then he stood up and said he was ready, said he understood why this was happening, said he was sorry for what he'd participated in, said he hoped his death would mean something. I don't know if McCaffrey's apology was sincere or if he was just trying to die with some dignity, but I'll give him credit for that much. He faced what was coming with more courage than the others showed. Tartaglia died still spitting hatred and racial slurs. McCaffrey died quiet and accepting. Both died, though. That was the important part. Both stopped being problems for Harlem. Both became examples. The coordination was precise, explains Henderson. We'd planned for every contingency. What if someone screamed? We'd kill them immediately and dispose of the body, accepting the increased risk. What if police came? We had lookouts posted. We had escape routes planned. We had alibis prepared. What if witnesses saw something? We'd chosen locations specifically because they had no witnesses, but if someone did see something, we had plans for dealing with that too. But none of those contingencies became necessary. The plan executed perfectly. 6 men intercepted, 6 men killed, 6 bodies disposed of in 3 different locations in New Jersey, far enough apart that even if one grave was discovered, it wouldn't lead to the others. 6 disappearances that left no evidence, no witnesses, no connection to Bumpy Johnson or Stephanie St. Clair beyond the knowledge that existed in the heads of 9 men who would carry that secret for the rest of their lives. By midnight on May 8, 1934, all 6 bodies had been buried. All 3 teams had returned to Harlem. All 9 executioners were in the warehouse on 142nd Street reporting to Bumpy that the operation was complete, no complications, no witnesses, no evidence. 6 white mobsters who'd started that day alive and confident were now dead and gone, erased so completely that the police investigation that would inevitably follow would find absolutely nothing. Bumpy listened to each team's report, Henderson remembers. He asked detailed questions, made sure we'd followed every aspect of the plan, made sure we hadn't left anything behind that could be traced, made sure nobody had been seen, made sure the disposal sites were secure. When he was satisfied that the operation had been executed perfectly, he paid each of us $500, a fortune in 1934 when most Harlem residents were earning maybe $15 a week. Then he reminded us of the most important rule: silence. Nobody talks about what happened tonight, Bumpy said. Not to wives, not to girlfriends, not to family, not to other criminals, not to anyone. What we did tonight stays between the 10 of us in this room. If I hear that anyone broke silence, that person will join Delancey and his crew in the ground, and anyone they told will join them too. This secret dies with us, or we all die with this secret. Every man in that room understood. This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Bumpy Johnson didn't make idle threats. And keeping this secret wasn't just about protecting ourselves. It was about protecting Madame Queen's organization, protecting the message we'd sent, protecting the power dynamic shift we'd just accomplished. 6 men had disappeared. Bumpy Johnson had made it happen. And nobody except the 9 men in that room would ever know for certain what had happened to Delancey and his crew. Rumors would circulate. Speculation would run wild. Schultz would know in his gut what had happened, even if he could never prove it. But the truth would remain hidden, protected by silence, protected by fear, protected by the understanding that breaking that silence meant death. The immediate aftermath was chaos for Dutch Schultz. 6 of his enforcers had vanished, simply failed to come home. Their cars were found where they'd been parked near Lenox Avenue and on 140th Street. The vehicles were locked, no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of what had happened, just empty cars belonging to men who'd ceased to exist. Schultz went crazy trying to find them, says Henrietta Queen Hen Williams, 84, who was Stephanie St. Clair's assistant in the 1930s, and who took phone calls from Schultz's intermediaries in the days following the disappearances. He had police searching all over Harlem, had his own men questioning people, threatening people, offering rewards for information, offered $1,000, an enormous sum in 1934, for information leading to finding his missing enforcers. But nobody knew anything, or at least nobody who knew was willing to tell Schultz anything. The colored community understood what had happened and why it happened. They didn't have details, didn't know exactly who'd done it or how it had been done, but they understood the basic equation. White mobsters come to Harlem disrespecting colored people. White mobsters disappear. Message received. The silence was its own form of resistance. The fact that nobody in Harlem would help Schultz find his missing men demonstrated that the community supported what had been done, even if they didn't know exactly what had been done. It demonstrated that Harlem residents saw Bumpy and Madame Queen as defenders rather than criminals. It demonstrated that the racial solidarity of the colored community was stronger than any incentive Schultz could offer. The police investigation was perfunctory at best, actively obstructed at worst. The New York Police Department in 1934 was thoroughly corrupt, particularly when it came to organized crime. Many officers were on Schultz's payroll, but many others were on Madame Queen's payroll. And the officers who weren't bought by either side mostly didn't care what happened to white mobsters who disappeared in Harlem. The official view seemed to be that criminals killing criminals wasn't worth serious police resources. Detectives came to Harlem and asked questions, says Wallace Green, 81, whose father was a Harlem resident who was interviewed by police about the disappearances. But their hearts weren't in it. You could tell they were just going through the motions, filling out paperwork so they could say they'd investigated. They didn't really want to find those white boys, didn't want to deal with the complications of prosecuting whoever had killed them. Easier to let it go unsolved, easier to let Harlem handle its own business. My father told the police he hadn't seen anything, didn't know anything, and that was true. He didn't know anything. But even if he had known something, he wouldn't have told them, because those white mobsters had been exploiting Harlem, had been taking money from colored people, had been disrespecting the community, and whatever happened to them, well, that was justice. Street justice, maybe. Rough justice. But justice nonetheless. The newspapers reported the disappearances, of course. 6 white men vanishing in Harlem was news. The New York Times ran a story on page 12. 6 men missing after visiting Harlem. The Daily News was more sensational. 6 white collectors vanish in mysterious Harlem disappearances. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, ran a small item that was carefully neutral in tone but subtly supportive in implication. 6 Schultz enforcers missing after Harlem collections. Community offers no information. But none of the newspapers had the full story. Didn't know about the racial slur. Didn't know about Bumpy Johnson's involvement. Didn't know this was the opening salvo in a war that would eventually claim 40 or more of Schultz's men over the next 18 months. The press treated it as a mystery, as an unsolved crime, as evidence that Harlem was dangerous for white people, which was, in a way, exactly the message Bumpy wanted to send. Madame Queen was pleased, Williams remembers, more than pleased. She was triumphant, because this proved what she'd been saying all along, that we weren't powerless, that we could fight back, that white mobsters weren't invincible just because they had police and politicians on their payroll. She sent word to Bumpy that night. I was the one who delivered the message, that the operation had been a success, not just tactically, but strategically, that the disappearance of 6 white enforcers would send ripples through Schultz's organization and through the broader New York criminal underworld, that this would change how white mobsters thought about Harlem, that this was the beginning of taking back what Schultz had stolen. And she was right. Within days, we started hearing that Schultz's other enforcers were scared, that they didn't want to work Harlem anymore, that they were demanding higher pay to compensate for the danger, that some of them were refusing to come to Harlem at all, even when ordered. Fear is a weapon, as powerful as guns or knives, and Bumpy Johnson had just weaponized fear against Dutch Schultz's organization. Made it clear that working for Schultz in Harlem meant risking your life. Made it clear that colored people in Harlem would kill white mobsters who disrespected them. Made it clear that the racial hierarchy white people took for granted, white on top, colored on bottom, didn't apply in Harlem. Not anymore. Not after May 8, 1934. Schultz sent word through intermediaries that he wanted a meeting with Madame Queen and Bumpy, Williams continues, wanted to negotiate, wanted to find some accommodation that would end the violence, but Madame Queen sent back a message saying there was nothing to negotiate, that Harlem was hers, would always be hers, that Schultz could either leave peacefully or leave in pieces, his organization destroyed one enforcer at a time. The boldness of that message stunned people. A colored woman telling a powerful white mobster to get out of her territory or face destruction, that was unprecedented. That was revolutionary. That was possible only because Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated through action that Madam Queen's threats weren't empty, that colored people in Harlem had the capability and the will to kill white mobsters. That power had shifted, at least in this one neighborhood, at least temporarily. The newspapers reported the disappearances, of course. 6 white men vanishing in Harlem was news. But the newspapers didn't have the full story, didn't know about the racial slur, didn't know about Bumpy Johnson's involvement, didn't know this was the opening salvo in a war that would eventually claim 40 or more of Schultz's men over the next 18 months. The Amsterdam News ran a small item, Henderson recalls, smiling at the memory, something like 6 Schultz enforcers missing after Harlem collections. Didn't say what happened to them, didn't speculate, just reported the fact. But everybody in Harlem knew. Everybody understood the message. Schultz sent word through intermediaries that he wanted a meeting with Madam Queen and Bumpy, wanted to negotiate, but Madam Queen sent back a message saying there was nothing to negotiate. Harlem was hers, would always be hers, and any more white men who came to Harlem disrespecting colored people would face the same fate as Delancey and his crew. What made the disappearance of 6 white mobsters particularly significant wasn't just the tactical success, it was the psychological impact on Dutch Schultz's organization and the broader message it sent about racial power dynamics in 1934 Harlem. White men weren't supposed to disappear in colored neighborhoods, explains Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian who specializes in Harlem's criminal history and who's interviewed dozens of people with connections to the numbers wars of the 1930s. The entire system of racial capitalism that allowed white mobsters to exploit black communities depended on an assumption of white invulnerability. White men could come into Harlem, take what they wanted, treat colored people however they pleased, and face no meaningful consequences because the legal system, the police, the entire apparatus of state power would protect them. What Bumpy did on May 8, 1934, shattered that assumption. He demonstrated that white skin didn't guarantee safety, that white mobsters could be killed just as easily as colored people, that Harlem could be dangerous for white men who disrespected its residents. This was revolutionary, not in the sense of overthrowing the government, but in the sense of inverting the normal power dynamics of racial interaction in 1934 America. For one night, in one neighborhood, colored people had the power of life and death over white people, and they exercised that power without mercy. The psychological warfare aspect was deliberate, Henderson confirms. Bumpy wanted Schultz's other enforcers scared, wanted them looking over their shoulders every time they came to Harlem, wanted them wondering if they'd be next. Fear is a weapon, Bumpy always said. Make your enemies afraid, and half your work is already done. And it worked. After May 8th, Schultz had trouble finding white enforcers willing to work Harlem. The money wasn't worth the risk. Word spread through the mob that Harlem was different, that colored gangsters there would kill white men, that you couldn't rely on your whiteness to protect you. Some of Schultz's enforcers quit. Others demanded higher pay to compensate for the danger. The whole operation became more expensive and less effective. The ripple effects of May 8th extended far beyond Schultz's immediate personnel problems. The disappearances forced a broader recalculation among New York's criminal organizations about the cost and risk of operating in Harlem. White mobsters had to confront the reality that colored communities weren't passively waiting to be exploited, that resistance existed, that violence could flow in both directions across the color line. This was a fundamental shift in how race and power interacted in New York's criminal underworld, explains Dr. Marcus Williams. Before May 8, 1934, the working assumption among white criminals was that they could operate anywhere, including in colored neighborhoods, with relative impunity. They had police protection, they had political connections, they had the backing of a legal system that rarely prosecuted white people for crimes against colored people. But May 8th demonstrated that institutional protection didn't matter if you got killed before you could invoke it. that police corruption didn't help you if your body was buried in New Jersey where it would never be found, that political connections were useless if nobody could prove who'd killed you. Bumpy Johnson essentially created a counter-deterrent. White mobsters had always used the threat of violence to control colored communities. Bumpy used actual violence, swift, final, unprovable violence, to make white mobsters afraid to operate in Harlem. He weaponized fear against people who'd used fear as a weapon their entire careers. The strategic brilliance of the operation lay not just in its execution, but in its public ambiguity. Nobody could prove what had happened to Delancey and his crew. The police investigation went nowhere. The newspapers speculated but had no facts. Schultz suspected but couldn't confirm. The families mourned but had no closure. But the colored community in Harlem knew, not the details necessarily, not the specifics of how it was done or who exactly was involved, but they knew the fundamental equation. White mobsters disrespected colored people. White mobsters disappeared. Bumpy Johnson was involved somehow, and that knowledge, that understanding that justice had been delivered even if the mechanisms of that delivery remained mysterious, strengthened Bumpy's position in the community. People started looking at Bumpy different after May 8th, says Dolores Martin, 75, whose grandfather was a numbers runner in Harlem during the 1930s and who grew up hearing stories about that era. Before, he was known as Madame Queen's enforcer, respected but feared. After May 8th, he was something more. He was a defender, a protector, the man who'd proven that colored people in Harlem weren't powerless victims, the man who'd made white mobsters afraid. My grandfather used to talk about how the whole atmosphere in Harlem changed after those white boys disappeared. There was this sense of pride, this feeling that we'd fought back and won, that we demonstrated we wouldn't be pushed around forever, that our community had teeth. It wasn't that everybody supported violence. My grandfather was a religious man who believed in turning the other cheek. But even he understood that sometimes, when peaceful resistance fails, when the legal system offers no recourse, when oppression becomes intolerable, violence becomes the only language power understands. He didn't celebrate what Bumpy did, but he understood why it had to be done. The families of the 6 missing men never got closure, never learned what happened to their husbands and brothers and sons. They mourned without bodies to bury. They demanded police investigations that went nowhere. They pleaded with Dutch Schultz to find their men, not knowing that Schultz had no power to undo what Bumpy Johnson had done. Margaret Delancey, Arthur's widow, placed advertisements in newspapers for months, says Clara Martinez, 72, a researcher who studied the families affected by Harlem's gang wars. Missing. Arthur Delancey, 34, last seen May 8, 1934 in Harlem, $500 reward for information. She never stopped looking, never accepted that he was gone. Died in 1962, still not knowing what happened to her husband, still hoping somehow he'd been kidnapped and was alive somewhere, still waiting for him to come home. The other families were the same. Corrigan's wife had 3 young children who grew up asking where their father was. O'Malley's mother was 72 years old, and his disappearance may have contributed to her death 6 months later. Family members said she died of a broken heart, of the stress of not knowing. Schulman's wife remarried eventually, but named her second son Robert in memory of her missing first husband. Tartaglia's family hired private investigators who found nothing. McCaffrey's sister became obsessed with spiritualism, attending seances trying to contact her dead brother's spirit, never accepting that he was simply gone. Part of me feels sympathy for those families, Martinez continues. They lost loved ones and never got answers. They suffered the unique torture of ambiguous loss, the not knowing, the inability to grieve properly because there's no body, no proof of death, just absence. That's a special kind of cruelty. But another part of me understands that those men weren't innocent victims. They were enforcers for a violent criminal organization. They participated in the exploitation and degradation of Harlem's residents. Arthur Delancey used racial slurs casually, confidently, believing there would be no consequences. The others stood by and let it happen, laughed when it happened, participated in the system of racial oppression that made such degradation possible. Their widows mourned them. Their children missed them, but the colored community didn't. To Harlem's residents, those 6 white mobsters got what they deserved. It was brutal, it was final, but it was also a form of justice in a world that offered colored people no other avenue for defending their dignity. The moral calculus of violence is never simple. Taking a human life, even in the name of justice, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate victim. 6 men died on May 8th. 6 families were destroyed. Children grew up without fathers. Wives became widows. Parents buried the hope of ever seeing their sons again, even if they couldn't bury their sons' bodies. But those 6 lives were taken in response to a system that had taken countless colored lives, countless colored futures, countless colored dreams. A system that treated black people as less than human. A system that allowed white men to come into black neighborhoods and steal wealth and degrade people with casual racism. A system that offered no legitimate recourse, no path to justice through legal channels, no protection from exploitation. In that context, what Bumpy Johnson did on May 8, 1934 makes sense, even if it doesn't make us comfortable. Violence in defense of dignity, violence as resistance against oppression, violence as the only available answer to violence that was already being committed, the structural violence of racism, the economic violence of exploitation, the psychological violence of degradation. I don't glorify what we did, Henderson says. I don't tell this story to celebrate violence. I tell it so people understand that colored people in 1934 had no good options. We could accept oppression passively and watch white mobsters destroy our community, or we could fight back using the same methods our oppressors used. Neither option was moral in an absolute sense, but fighting back was more moral than surrendering. Those 6 white men came to Harlem thinking they were untouchable, thinking they could take our money and disrespect our people and face no consequences because the legal system and the political system and the entire structure of American society protected white people and oppressed colored people. They were partially right. Those systems did protect them, but those systems couldn't protect them from Bumpy Johnson and 9 colored men with knives who'd decided enough was enough. What we did was illegal. What we did was violent. What we did deprived 6 families of closure and caused suffering that extended far beyond the immediate victims. But what we did was also necessary, because sometimes justice doesn't come through courts and laws and official channels. Sometimes justice comes through direct action, through resistance, through making oppressors understand that oppression carries risks. The events of May 8, 1934 were part of a larger pattern of violence that characterized the Harlem Numbers War. Over the next 18 months, approximately 40 of Dutch Schultz's enforcers and associates would be killed or kidnapped. Some died in shootings on Harlem streets. Some were found beaten to death in Mount Morris Park, their bodies left in public as messages. Some disappeared without trace, like Delancey's crew. Some were found floating in the Harlem River or the Hudson River with their throats cut. The war was brutal and asymmetric. Schultz had more men and more resources, but Bumpy Johnson had intimate knowledge of Harlem's geography, the support of a community that saw him as a defender, and a willingness to employ violence so extreme it terrorized even experienced criminals. The guerrilla tactics Bumpy and his crew employed over those 18 months changed the calculations about operating in Harlem. Picking off Dutch Schultz's men was relatively easy, Henderson explains, because they were visible. They were white in a colored neighborhood. They stood out. They couldn't blend in. They couldn't disappear into crowds of colored faces. Every time a white enforcer came to Harlem, we could track him, follow him, learn his routines, and then eliminate him when the opportunity arose. We varied our methods so the police couldn't identify a pattern. Sometimes it was shootings, quick, public, designed to create fear. Sometimes it was kidnappings that led to executions in private. Sometimes it was bodies left in public. Sometimes bodies disappeared forever. The inconsistency kept Schultz's organization off balance, kept them unable to predict where or how the next attack would come. We used Harlem's geography against them, the narrow streets, the alleys, the buildings with multiple exits, the rooftops connected to each other. All of that made Harlem difficult terrain for outsiders to navigate. We knew every block, every building, every escape route. Schultz's men were operating in unfamiliar territory. They didn't know which streets to avoid, didn't know which buildings had back exits, didn't know where the ambush points were. They were at a fundamental disadvantage every time they entered Harlem. The war might have continued indefinitely, except for two developments that changed everything. First, Stephanie St. Clair was arrested in late 1935 on gambling charges that Dutch Schultz had orchestrated through his police connections. With Madame Queen in prison, her organization was weakened. Bumpy tried to maintain operations, but without St. Clair's leadership and financial resources, the position became untenable. Second, and more significantly, Dutch Schultz was murdered on October 23, 1935, by order of Lucky Luciano and the Commission, not because of Bumpy's guerrilla war, but because Schultz wanted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey, and the Commission feared such a high-profile murder would bring too much law enforcement attention to organized crime. Murder, Inc. hitmen shot Schultz and 3 of his associates at the Palace Chop House in Newark. Schultz died the next day. With Schultz dead and St. Clair in prison, the dynamic of the Harlem Numbers War shifted completely. Bumpy Johnson negotiated directly with Lucky Luciano, the head of what would become the Genovese crime family. The agreement they reached allowed Bumpy to control Harlem's numbers rackets independently, provided he paid a percentage to the Italian mob. It wasn't perfect, explains Dr. Williams. Colored people were still paying tribute to white mobsters. The Italian mob still profited from Harlem's economy, but it was better than outright takeover, better than white mobsters running everything directly, better than what Schultz had been trying to impose. And critically, the agreement established Bumpy as the mediator between Harlem and the larger criminal syndicate. He became, in effect, the godfather of Harlem. No criminal activity happened in Harlem without Bumpy's knowledge and approval. The Italian mob had to go through Bumpy to operate in Harlem. Bumpy had achieved what St. Clair had been fighting for: colored control of colored neighborhoods, even if that control came with financial obligations to white criminals. That position of power, that independence, that respect, it all traces back to May 8, 1934. To the night Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that colored people could fight back against white supremacy. To the night 6 white men disappeared because one of them couldn't keep a racial slur out of his mouth. To the night the balance of power shifted, just for a moment, just in one neighborhood, in favor of the oppressed. The legacy of May 8, 1934 extends beyond just the immediate impact on Harlem's numbers war. It represents a broader truth about resistance, power, and justice in America's racial history. It demonstrates that oppressed people have always fought back, even when that resistance was violent, even when that resistance was illegal, even when that resistance contradicted the comfortable narratives of nonviolent civil rights struggle that we prefer to tell. Bumpy Johnson is often romanticized in popular culture, Lawrence observes. He's portrayed as a gentleman gangster, as a Robin Hood figure who stole from the rich to give to the poor, as a community defender who protected Harlem from white exploitation. There's truth in those portrayals, but they elide the violence. They sanitize the brutality. They make Bumpy's resistance palatable by ignoring how that resistance was actually accomplished. The reality is that Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who killed people, killed a lot of people. The reality is that on May 8, 1934, he ordered the execution of 6 men who were then hunted, caught, and buried in unmarked graves. The reality is that justice for colored people in 1934 required violence because the legal system offered no other recourse. That's uncomfortable. That challenges our preferences for neat moral categories. That forces us to grapple with the fact that resistance against oppression isn't always righteous and noble and clean. Sometimes it's brutal. Sometimes it involves creating victims. Sometimes the price of dignity is measured in lives taken. But understanding that discomfort, sitting with that moral ambiguity, is necessary if we're going to honestly reckon with America's racial history. The sanitized versions of history that focus only on peaceful protest and legal victories miss half the story. They miss the violence that oppressed people committed in response to the violence committed against them. They miss the anger and rage and desperate resistance that characterized how colored people actually fought back against white supremacy. May 8, 1934 is part of that hidden history, part of the story we don't tell because it makes us uncomfortable, but it's true. It happened. 6 white men disappeared. Bumpy Johnson made it happen, and the colored community in Harlem understood it as a form of justice, even if that justice came through methods that violated every legal and moral standard of civilized society. Today, 90 years after the events of May 8, 1934, the warehouse on 142nd Street where Bumpy planned the operation is an apartment building. The alley where Delancey and Corrigan met their end has been filled in, converted to a small parking lot. The saloon on 138th Street closed decades ago. The stable where Tartaglia and McCaffrey were killed was demolished in 1947. Mount Morris Park, where so many of Schultz's enforcers were found dead during the Numbers War, is now Marcus Garvey Park, a green space where children play and families picnic, unknowing of the blood that once soaked into its soil. The graves in New Jersey, if they still exist, if they haven't been disturbed by construction or development over 9 decades, remain unmarked and undiscovered. Arthur Delancey, Michael Corrigan, James O'Malley, Robert Schulman, Vincent Tartaglia, and Thomas McCaffrey are still officially listed as missing persons in NYPD files. Their cases remain technically open, though nobody has actively investigated them in 70 years. Their families died without answers. Their grandchildren probably don't even know the story of their missing grandfathers. The men who participated in the events of May 8th are nearly all gone now. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968 at age 62, suffering a heart attack while eating dinner at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969 at age 82. Patterson James died in 2019 at age 90. Fast Willie Rollins died in 2023 at age 95. Most of the others passed between 1990 and 2020, carrying their secrets to graves as unmarked as the ones they dug in New Jersey in 1934. Robert Henderson, now 94 and living in a nursing home in Newark, is the last surviving member of Bumpy's crew from that night. He agreed to share his memories for this story because, as he says, history should be told truthfully, even when that truth is ugly. He's promised to reveal the location of the burial sites after his death, though he refuses to disclose them while alive for fear of implicating anyone who might still face legal consequences. "I never felt guilty about what we did," Patterson said before he died in 2019. "I know that sounds cold. I know those men had families who mourned them, but I can't feel guilty for defending our community against people who were exploiting us, who were degrading us, who thought their whiteness gave them the right to call us NRs without consequence. What we did was violent. What we did was illegal. What we did violated moral principles that society claims to hold sacred. But what we did was also necessary, because sometimes justice doesn't come through courts and laws and official channels that exist to protect oppressors from the oppressed. Sometimes justice comes through direct action, through resistance, through making oppressors understand personally, individually, fatally, that oppression carries risks. Those 6 white men came to Harlem thinking they were untouchable, thinking they could take our money and disrespect our people and face no consequences. They were wrong, and every other white mobster who thought about moving into Harlem after May 8th had to reconsider whether the money was worth the risk. That's what we accomplished that night. We reclaimed our dignity. We defended our community. We demonstrated that colored people in Harlem weren't powerless victims waiting to be saved by white liberals or crushed by white supremacy. We were fighters. We were killers when we had to be, and we would not tolerate disrespect. Henderson is more reflective about the moral dimensions of what happened. "What we did haunts me sometimes," he admits. "Not because I think it was wrong, I still believe it was justified, but because of what it says about the world we lived in. That colored people in 1934 had no recourse except violence, that the legal system wouldn't protect us, that we had to protect ourselves through the same brutal methods our oppressors used. I wish we'd lived in a world where Bumpy could have gone to the police and reported that Delancey used racial slurs and threatened our workers, and the police would have arrested Delancey and prosecuted him. But that wasn't the world we lived in. The police worked for Schultz. The courts served white supremacy. We had no legitimate avenue for justice, so we took illegitimate justice. We became what we had to become to survive. And yes, 6 men died, 6 families were destroyed. But how many colored people did Schultz's organization brutalize? How many colored families were ruined financially by the mob takeover of our businesses? How many colored people died because they resisted Schultz's takeover before May 8th? Context matters. We weren't the aggressors. We were defenders fighting back against an invading force. The violence we committed was reactive, not proactive. That doesn't make it right, necessarily, but it makes it understandable. It makes it human. It makes it a rational response to an irrational situation where survival required brutality. Fast Willie Rollins, interviewed months before his death in 2023, offered perhaps the most succinct summary of May 8, 1934, and its significance. That night proved something important, he said. It proved that colored people weren't powerless, that we could fight back, that white supremacy wasn't invincible. For one night, in one neighborhood, we had the power, and we used it. Bumpy Johnson spent the rest of his life building on what we started that night, building an independent criminal organization controlled by colored people, building relationships with the Italian mob that were based on mutual respect rather than subordination, building a reputation as someone who couldn't be pushed around, couldn't be disrespected, couldn't be treated as less than. All of that traces back to May 8th, to 6 white men who disappeared, to a racial slur that triggered consequences, to a moment when Harlem said no more, to Bumpy Johnson hearing that word through an open window and deciding, in that instant, that Arthur Delancey and anyone who'd stood with him while he said it would not see another sunrise. The story of May 8th, 1934 is brutal, violent, morally complicated, but it's true. And truth, even uncomfortable truth, especially uncomfortable truth, deserves to be told, deserves to be remembered, deserves to be understood as part of the hidden history of how oppressed people actually fought back against their oppression. 6 men disappeared that night, but the message they left behind, the message Bumpy Johnson wrote in their absence, lasted for decades, lasted through Bumpy's lifetime, lasted through the evolution of Harlem from a battleground to a community that, while still facing immense challenges, had learned to defend itself, had learned that resistance was possible, had learned that dignity was worth fighting for, even killing for, even dying for. 90 years later, we're still grappling with the questions raised by May 8, 1934, questions about justice and violence, about resistance and brutality, about when, if ever, oppressed people are justified in using the same violent methods their oppressors use, about whether dignity can be defended through means that violate human dignity, about whether 6 lives taken in Harlem in 1934 represent justice or just more violence in a cycle that never ends. There are no easy answers, but there is the truth. And the truth is that on May 8, 1934, a white mobster called colored people en auteurs in a Harlem collection spot. Bumpy Johnson heard him, and by midnight that night, 6 white men had been hunted, executed, and buried in unmarked graves in New Jersey, where their bodies remain to this day. That's what happened. That's why it happened. That's the story nobody tells, but everybody who knows Harlem's real history understands. Bumpy Johnson made sure Arthur Delancey paid the ultimate price for a racial slur, made sure those 6 white mobsters learned too late that colored people in Harlem in 1934 weren't passive victims waiting to be degraded, made sure every other white criminal in New York understood that Harlem was different, that Harlem was dangerous for people who disrespected its residents, that Harlem was territory where white supremacy had limits. The families never found the bodies, never got answers, never got closure, but Harlem got respect, and sometimes, in 1934, in a world built on racial oppression and white supremacy, Respect cost 6 lives. That's the price Arthur Delancey paid for one word. That's the price Dutch Schultz's organization paid for thinking they could exploit Harlem without consequences. That's the price of disrespect in a community that finally said enough. 6 men disappeared that night. 90 years later, their graves remain hidden, but their disappearance remains one of the most significant and most hushed moments in Harlem's long struggle for dignity, power, and the right to exist without degradation. This is the story of May 8, 1934, the story of what happens when oppression meets resistance, the story of 6 disappearances that changed Harlem, the story of Bumpy Johnson's justice, brutal, final, true. The families of the 6 missing men never got closure, never learned what happened to their husbands and brothers and sons. They mourned without bodies to bury. They demanded police investigations that went nowhere. They pleaded with Dutch Schultz to find their men, not knowing that Schultz had no power to undo what Bumpy Johnson had done. Margaret Delancey, Arthur's widow, placed advertisements in newspapers for months, says Clara Martinez, 72, a researcher who studied the families affected by Harlem's gang wars. Missing, Arthur Delancey, 34, last seen May 8, 1934 in Harlem, $500 reward for information. She never stopped looking, died in 1962, still not knowing what happened to her husband. The other families were the same. They suspected violence, suspected murder, but without bodies, without evidence, without witnesses, they had nothing. Just absence and grief and unanswered questions. Part of me feels sympathy for those families, Martinez continues. They lost loved ones and never got answers. But another part of me understands that those men weren't innocent victims. They were enforcers for a violent criminal organization. They participated in the exploitation and degradation of Harlem's residents. Arthur Delancey used racial slurs casually, confidently, believing there would be no consequences. His widow mourned him, but the colored community didn't. To them, he got what he deserved. The moral calculus of violence is never simple, but in the context of 1934, in the context of racial oppression and power imbalances and systemic injustice, what happened on May 8th made sense to the people who lived through it. It was brutal, it was final, but it was also a form of resistance against an unjust system that gave colored people no other recourse. The events of May 8, 1934, were part of a larger pattern of violence that characterized the Harlem Numbers War. Over the next 18 months, approximately 40 of Dutch Schultz's enforcers and associates would be killed or kidnapped. Some died in shootings. Some disappeared like Delancey's crew. Some were found beaten to death in Mount Morris Park or floating in the Harlem River. The war was brutal and asymmetric. Schultz had more men and more resources, but Bumpy Johnson had intimate knowledge of Harlem's geography and the support of a community that saw him as a defender rather than a criminal. Bumpy and his crew of 9 waged a guerrilla war of sorts, Henderson explains, echoing the description that would later appear in Mamie Johnson's biography of her husband. Picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. They stood out. They were visible. They were vulnerable. We used that visibility against them. We'd track them, learn their routes, learn where they collected money, learn where they drank and ate and conducted business. Then we'd strike when they were isolated, quick, violent, final, and we'd leave the bodies where Schultz would find them, as messages, as warnings, as demonstrations that Harlem belonged to colored people and white mobsters were operating on borrowed time. The war might have continued indefinitely except for 2 developments. First, Stephanie St. Clair was arrested in late 1935 on gambling charges, charges that Dutch Schultz had orchestrated through his police connections. With Madame Queen in prison, her organization was weakened. Second, and more significantly, Dutch Schultz was murdered in October 1935 by order of Lucky Luciano and the Commission, not because of Bumpy's guerrilla war, but because Schultz wanted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey, and the Commission feared such a high-profile murder would bring too much law enforcement attention. With Schultz dead and St. Clair in prison, Bumpy Johnson negotiated directly with Lucky Luciano, says Dr. Williams. The agreement allowed Bumpy to control Harlem's numbers rackets independently, provided he paid a percentage to the Italian mob. It wasn't perfect. Colored people were still paying tribute to white mobsters, but it was better than outright takeover, and it established Bumpy as the mediator between Harlem and the larger criminal syndicate. He became, in effect, the godfather of Harlem. That position, that power, that independence, it all traces back to May 8, 1934. To the night, Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that colored people could fight back against white supremacy. To the night, 6 white men disappeared because one of them couldn't keep a racial slur out of his mouth. Today, 90 years after the events of May 8, 1934, the warehouse on 142nd Street where Bumpy planned the operation is an apartment building. The alley where Delancey and Corrigan met their end has been filled in, converted to a small parking lot. The saloon on 138th Street closed decades ago. Mount Morris Park, where so many of Schultz's enforcers were found dead during the Numbers War, is now Marcus Garvey Park, a green space where children play and families picnic, unknowing of the blood that once soaked into its soil. The graves in New Jersey, if they still exist, if they haven't been disturbed by construction or development over 9 decades, remain unmarked and undiscovered. Arthur Delancey, Michael Corrigan, James O'Malley, Robert Schulman, Vincent Tartaglia, and Thomas McCaffrey are still officially listed as missing persons. Their cases remain open in NYPD files, though nobody has actively investigated them in 70 years. The men who participated in the events of May 8th are nearly all gone now. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969. Most of Bumpy's crew from the 1930s have passed. The few survivors, men like Patterson, Henderson, and Fast Willie, are in their late 70s and 80s, carrying memories of a night that changed Harlem's history, but that they've mostly kept secret until now. I never felt guilty about what we did, Patterson says. I know that sounds cold. I know those men had families who mourned them, but I can't feel guilty for defending our community against people who were exploiting us, who were degrading us, who thought their whiteness gave them the right to call us NRs without consequence. What we did was violent. What we did was illegal. But what we did was also necessary, because sometimes justice doesn't come through courts and laws and official channels. Sometimes justice comes through direct action, through resistance, through making oppressors understand that oppression carries risks. Those 6 white men came to Harlem thinking they were untouchable, thinking they could take our money and disrespect our people and face no consequences. They were wrong. And every other white mobster who thought about moving into Harlem after May 8th had to reconsider whether the money was worth the risk. That's what we accomplished that night. Henderson is more reflective about the moral dimensions of what happened. What we did haunts me sometimes, he admits. Not because I think it was wrong, I still believe it was justified, but because of what it says about the world we lived in. That colored people in 1934 had no recourse except violence, that the legal system wouldn't protect us, that we had to protect ourselves through the same brutal methods our oppressors used. I wish we'd lived in a world where Bumpy could have gone to the police and reported that Delancey used racial slurs and threatened our workers, and the police would have arrested Delancey and prosecuted him, but that wasn't the world we lived in. The police worked for Schultz. The court served white supremacy. We had no legitimate avenue for justice, so we took illegitimate justice. We became what we had to become to survive. And yes, 6 men died. But how many colored people did Schultz's organization brutalize? How many colored families were ruined financially by the mob takeover of our businesses? How many colored people died because they resisted Schultz's takeover? Context matters. We weren't the aggressors. We were defenders fighting back against an invading force. The violence we committed was reactive, not proactive. That doesn't make it right, necessarily, but it makes it understandable. Fast Willie Rollins, now 76 and living in a nursing home in the Bronx, offers perhaps the most succinct summary of May 8, 1934, and its significance. That night proved something important, he says. It proved that colored people weren't powerless, that we could fight back, that white supremacy wasn't invincible. For one night, in one neighborhood, we had the power, and we used it. Bumpy Johnson spent the rest of his life building on what we started that night, building an independent criminal organization controlled by colored people, building relationships with the Italian mob that were based on mutual respect rather than subordination, building a reputation as someone who couldn't be pushed around, couldn't be disrespected, couldn't be treated as less than. All of that traces back to May 8th, to 6 white men who disappeared, to a racial slur that triggered consequences, to a moment when Harlem said no more. The historical record will probably never officially acknowledge what happened on May 8, 1934. The disappearances remain unsolved mysteries. The truth died with most of the participants. But among the people who know, among the descendants of the runners who worked those collection spots, among the families who remember the stories their grandfathers told, the truth survives. 6 white men came to Harlem and disrespected colored people once too often. They called someone the N-word. They believed their whiteness would protect them. They were wrong, and they paid the ultimate price for that mistake. That's the story of May 8, 1934. That's the story nobody tells, but everybody who knows Harlem's real history understands. That's the story of how one racial slur triggered 6 disappearances and became a turning point in the battle for control of Harlem's streets. Bumpy Johnson, who heard that slur through an open window on a spring afternoon, who felt the rage that every colored person felt when white people dehumanized them, who channeled that rage into calculated action rather than impulsive violence, who orchestrated the disappearance of 6 men in 90 minutes and left no evidence. Bumpy Johnson understood something fundamental about power and justice and resistance. He understood that oppressed people can't always wait for justice to be delivered through official channels. Sometimes they have to deliver it themselves. Sometimes resistance requires violence. Sometimes the only way to stop disrespect is to make disrespect so costly that people stop doing it. It's a brutal lesson, an uncomfortable lesson, a lesson that challenges easy moral categorizations of right and wrong. But it's the lesson of May 8, 1934, the lesson that Harlem learned that night, the lesson that 6 white mobsters learned too late. 90 years later, the graves remain unmarked. The files remain open. The families never got closure. But Harlem got something more important: dignity, proof that colored people wouldn't tolerate degradation forever, proof that resistance was possible, proof that power could shift, even temporarily, even violently, in favor of the oppressed. That's worth remembering, that's worth telling, that's worth understanding, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if it challenges our assumptions about justice and violence and racial dynamics in American history. May 8, 1934. 6 men disappeared. One racial slur echoed through the streets of Harlem, and the balance of power shifted just for a moment, just in one neighborhood, but shifted nevertheless. Bumpy Johnson made sure of that. The families never found the bodies, never got answers, never got closure, but Harlem got respect. And sometimes, in 1934, in a world built on racial oppression and white supremacy, respect cost 6 lives. That's the price Arthur Delancey paid for one word. That's the price Dutch Schultz's organization paid for thinking they could exploit Harlem without consequences. That's the price of disrespect in a community that finally said enough. 6 men disappeared that night. But the message they left behind, the message Bumpy Johnson wrote in their absence, lasted for decades, lasted through Bumpy's lifetime, lasted through the evolution of Harlem from a battleground to a community that, while still facing challenges, had learned to defend itself. The story of May 8, 1934 is brutal, violent, morally complicated, but it's true, and truth, even uncomfortable truth, deserves to be told.